Welcome everyone to our BMS talk. Today's talk is Survival of the Fittest, The Life and Struggles of Helen Gwynne-Vaughan by Dr. Patricia Fara. Dr. Patricia Fara is Emeritus Fellow at Clare College in Cambridge and a former head of the British Society for the History of Science. Her interests are in the Enlightenment, in scientific imagery and women in science. Of particular interest in today's talk is her book, A Lab of One's Own. Here's a copy. It's absolutely fantastic, and I fully recommend that everyone acquire a copy. It is absolutely wonderful. But enough from me. I'm going to pass over down to Dr. Patricia Fara, who will talk us through the life and struggles of Helen Gwynne-Vaughan.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Thank you for that nice plug for my book. So I'm going to be talking about Helen Gwynne-Vaughan, who was a pioneering mycologist in the first half of the 20th century. And you can see on the bottom right, there's a modern reprint of her famous book on fungi. So that illustrates how celebrated she is today. But of course, during her lifetime, it was quite difficult to be a female scientist. So there's the original copy of her book on the left, which came out in 1927, and it was very widely used. I'm hardly going to be talking about the book at all because I'm a historian, as Nathan said. I'm not a mycologist, and I don't want to end up talking to you about things you know far more about than me. So I'm going to be talking about her life and about the obstacles she faced. And normally, I'm actually an 18th century historian, and I hadn't heard of her until a few years ago when I started to write the book that Nathan's just mentioned, A Lab of One's Own. And it's about women and what they were doing in science in the First World War. And you can see that these are just a few of the women that I looked at, as Helen Gwynne-Vaughan is the woman in black and white at the bottom of the picture. And of all the women that I studied in the book, she was the one that I empathized with the most and found most interesting. And I think it's because her life was so difficult. She always felt out of place, whatever she was doing. As a woman, everyone regarded her as being abnormal because she was a scientist. But also, if she was in a scientific laboratory, people regarded her as being rather strange because she was a woman. And I read physics at Oxford a long while ago, and so I could empathize very strongly with that feeling of being in the wrong place the whole time. So I wasn't there in the early 20th century, but another woman who was her contemporary and who had a very, very similar experience was Mary Stopes. And Mary Stopes, most famous now, I think, for her book Married Love and for setting up all the family planning clinics and birth advice clinics, which are all over the world now. But she was also a botanist, a lecturer in paleobotany, and she was the first scientific lecturer, the first female scientific lecturer at Manchester University. And she found life there could be quite difficult. She said women high up in scientific positions, women with international reputations, which she had, she went to Japan, she was extremely well known, women are shut out from the concourse of their intellectual fellows. And she meant not just that they were largely shut out from universities, excluded from jobs, but also ordinary things. Like Rosalind Franklin in the 1950s complained that she couldn't go in the coffee room with the men that she was working with. So there were all sorts of ways in which women were excluded. And I think if you look back on the atmosphere, the attitude towards women in the early 20th century, the late 19th century, then this man, Charles Darwin, has got a lot to answer for. So that's one of the most famous pictures of him on the left. And on the right, his most famous book, The Origin of Species, that came out in 1859. And he was so worried about it because he knew it was going to be controversial that he didn't actually mention people in it. He sort of stopped when he got to stopped at the animals. But then a few years later, he plucked up courage, and he did. He published another book called The Descent of Man with the subtitle Selection in Relation to Sex. And in this, he explicitly did mention women. And what he did really was give scientific justification to prejudices that had been around for centuries. His basic argument was that over the millennia, while evolution has been happening, men and women have diverged because men have been chosen for their ability to fight animals, fight other people, build houses, go out and find the food, while women have been selected because of their ability to look after the children and to do the cooking. And he put it, so to summarize, he said the chief distinction in the intellectual powers of the two sexes is shown by a man's attaining to a high eminence in whatever he takes up than can woman, whether requiring deep thought, reason, imagination, or merely the use of the senses or the hands. So here it was on Darwin's scientific authority that no matter what they did, women were intellectually inferior to men. And this wasn't just a scientific debate. So you see, this is quotations taken from a speech in the House of Commons. You can see the House of Commons was all male. It was when they were discussing the vote. It was someone was campaigning against the vote for women. And the argument which Darwin and his successors put forward is that Europeans were more civilized than other people, and therefore European women and European men had diverged further apart than men and women in other cultures. So, as it was put in the House of Commons, an adult white woman differs far more from a white man than a negress or pygmy woman from her equivalent male. So it was also some sort of justification for Britain's imperialism as well. Many women, as well as men, thought that women's main role in life was to produce children, and this comparison between a horse and a woman was one that was frequently made during the 18th and 19th centuries, as well as the 20th century. There are quite a lot of words in common, like sort of bridled and tamed or harnessed. And you can see in the horse on the left, it says, "Is your mare in ideal breeding condition?" And quite a lot of men took the same attitude to women. And the quotation is by Francis Galton, who was Charles Darwin's cousin, and he's often known as the father of eugenics. And he was writing to the principal of Newnham College, explaining that he thought it was a very bad idea for any of her graduate students to work. He said, "A monstrous shame to use any of these gifted girls for hack work, such as breadwinning. It's as bad as using up the winners of the Oaks in harness work." So his idea was that women who had graduated from Newnham, and who he didn't particularly approve of it, but saying they had graduated, their role was to get married and to have children and to improve the British nation. So I'm very glad to say that women fought back. There were some intelligent women who used evolutionary arguments in opposition. So this is a quotation from a journal, a campaigning journal, Votes for Women. "The women of political and social activity will, in the future, be different from the domestic woman, just as Paleolithic man differs from his Neolithic brother." And this is one of my favourite bits of suffragist propaganda. It's a drawing of the anti-suffragist, or a word I can never say, prejudicidon. It says, "This curious animal has the smallest brain capacity of any living creature. Its sight is so imperfect that it can't see further than the end of its nose." So suffragists were putting out promotional material like this. They were also famously going on lots of marches, and many of the suffragists were very pro-science. So these are two gorgeous, very large silk banners, hand embroidered, that have still been preserved. They're the sort of banners that the women would take with them on marches. And you can see from the one on the right, it's supporting Marie Curie and radium to show that women could do science. And the one on the left is actually one of my favourites, and it shows an academic woman in her gown, and she's locked in behind a fence with what were then called convicts and lunatics, because those were two groups of men who, like women, were not allowed to have the vote. And the little caption at the top says, "It's time I got out of this place. Where shall I find the key? And Helen Gwynne-Vaughan was a very keen suffragist, and she presumably must have known about the medical arguments that were being put forward to explain why it was that suffragists behaved as they did. So this is by a famous bacteriologist, Sir Almroth Wright. When the doctor lets his eyes rest on the militant suffragist, he cannot conceal from himself the physiological emergencies which lie behind her mental disorder. These are the sexually embittered women in whom everything has turned into gall and bitterness of heart and hatred of men. So he was providing a physiological reason why women joined the suffrage movement, and he had a very simple remedy for this. He said all the suffragists should be packed off to the colonies because there were plenty of spare men around and they could all get married, and once they get married they'd settle down and their bodies and then hence their minds would be in a much better state. So these were the attitudes that confronted Helen Gwynne-Vaughan when she was starting out on her career as a botanist. So I'll talk a bit more about her life now. So she was born Helen Fraser, Scottish, and these are 3 pictures from different phases of her life, but also I chose them to illustrate different roles that she played in her life. So on the left, you can see she's dressed for a society portrait in these very aristocratic clothes, and she came from a very rich aristocratic family. Then in the middle, there's the uniform that she wore during the First World War when she went to France. And on the right is one of the official photographs from Birkbeck College, where she was head of the Department of Botany, and she was also professor for quite a long time as well. So, as I mentioned, her life was very difficult. I think her problems started in childhood. She was the daughter of an army captain, but her father died when she was very little, and her mother remarried. And the new father, the stepfather, was a diplomat, and they travelled all over Europe. And she spent a lot of her childhood here in Oporto in Portugal. And there was a big expatriate English community there, which she found very sort of stuffy and boring. The only periods of her childhood that she really enjoyed were the summers. And in the summer, they went back to Scotland. And this was the family estate. You can see it's very, very big. It's 100 acres. They were a very, very rich family. And she really enjoyed going back to Scotland every summer. She also managed to escape from Oporto and also from her parents by going to Cheltenham Ladies' College. And you can see that the teachers look pretty grim, but she enjoyed it there, and it was there that she decided that she wanted to become a scientist. So these are 2 pictures of her from this stage of her life, and they indicate that she was very wealthy, that she was very aristocratic, that she had a very sort of extravagant social life. She had lots of expensive clothes. She did lots of traveling abroad. So in many ways, it was a life to be envied. But she found it very frustrating, and she had endless rows with her parents because all she wanted to do was to go to university and study science. And they eventually caved in, and there was another row because she refused to go to Oxford, which was what they wanted. She wanted to go to King's College, and she wanted to study zoology. That was what she was set on. But then she encountered another obstacle. At that stage, King's College had 2 parts, one for men and one for women. So she had to go to King's College for ladies, and zoology was thought to be a very, very unsuitable subject for young ladies because there was all that dissection and then there were all the sexual organs. So she was forced to study botany instead. But she was allowed to go to some of the men's medical classes, and this is just an indication of the sort of group that she would have found herself in. But because there weren't any other women there, she found herself very much discriminated against. And there's also quite, sort of, in a way, trivial, but also quite important details. So there were no women's bathrooms. And so she said on the way home, after a dissection class, she used to stare at her reflection in the shop windows to make sure that she hadn't got any splashes of blood all over her face, and then she could wipe them off. Another problem was that she actually came top in botany, and she should have been awarded a special medal, the Carter Medal. But there was this marvellous argument that we've never given a medal to a woman before, therefore we can't start giving a medal to a woman now. And so she had a colossal battle to get her medal, but that was one of the many battles that she won, and she got it in the end. And you get some idea of her daily experience by reading H.G. Wells' book Anne Veronica, which is about an imaginary young woman who's a suffragist and a scientist, and her parents are very upset about both of those career choices that she made. And he evoked the atmosphere of the laboratory where she would have worked. It had an atmosphere that was all its own, long and narrow, a well-lit, ventilated, quiet gallery of small tables and sinks, pervaded by a thin smell of methylated spirit and a mitigated and sterilised organic decay. The photo on the right is of the Balfour laboratory that was in Cambridge before the war. And in his novel, H.G. Wells described how frustrated she felt at wearing petticoats. That was a constant complaint of women at this time, that they couldn't move freely because of all their clothes. And also Anne Veronica describes that when she went into the laboratory, before she opened the door, she hung her hat up on the hook because she was going into a place of equality. And this seems to be symbolically very, very important for women at this stage. So in 1905, the Linnaean Society, after a huge number of debates, finally admitted 25 women. And Helen Gwynne-Vaughan was one of them. And you can see that none of them are wearing hats. And that was under the influence of another mycologist, Gulielma Lister, who I think, but I'm not sure, that she's the woman right at the front on the right in profile. And another woman said, Gulielma Lister removed her hat in deference to the sexless character of a fellow. It was an unusual thing then for a lady to remove her hat. But we all took our cue from Miss Lister and did the same. And I assume that Helen Gwynne-Vaughan did, Helen Fraser, as she then was. But on the other hand, she'd been brought up to wear very extravagant clothes. She had this colossal wardrobe full of luxurious garments, and she really loved wearing them and dressing up. And she became sort of quite renowned for her clothes. And she certainly paid great attention to her appearance. So these are two quotes from men at the Linnaean. She was a peach of a girl, and she was a stunner. So she still found it difficult to be taken seriously as a scientist. Men were more interested in her looks. She was the year after that, she became an assistant lecturer at Royal Holloway College. And Royal Holloway College had only recently opened. It was the first all-women's college. So no, it wasn't the first, but it was a women-only college. And she didn't fit in very well there, because as you can see from the picture, most of the women are wearing very modest clothes. She chose to dress very flamboyantly. Even when she went for her interview with the head, her job interview, she thought that she'd completely blown it, because she went there wearing a brown linen dress and a flamboyant hat covered with nasturtiums. And she said afterwards, I suppose I looked unacademic, for the principal, Miss Penrose, asked me rather doubtfully if I had any experience of girls. So she was sort of regarded with great skepticism in this all-female community because she dressed quite extravagantly. And it's very difficult to interpret all the documents that survive, because they tend to be quite emphatic, either for or against her. And there aren't a huge number of them. And it's difficult to know to what extent she really did flout convention, to what extent she really was rather sort of stubborn, as she was reputed to be, and to what extent it was just other women being rather envious. But she did have a reputation amongst her colleagues at the Royal Holloway College of being very rude to colleagues of her own age, but very charming towards older male professors and charming them into acting as helpful patrons. And that's what people said when she met this man, David Gwynne-Vaughan. So the sort of rather jaundice view, which is presented in a lot of the comments of the time, was that they met in 1909. This was the year that the portrait I'm showing, that was painted that year. And there's David Gwynne-Vaughan, who at the time was a lecturer at Birkbeck, and he was an expert in fossil ferns. And the jaundice view is that when she found out that he was applying for a job in Belfast, she immediately became very friendly with him and then campaigned to get his job at Birkbeck and manoeuvred herself into it. And then 2 years later, she managed to marry him. But unlike married women conventionally did, instead of going to Belfast to live with him, she insisted on pursuing her own independent career. And so he was in Belfast, she was in London, and they commuted backwards and forwards, which was far, far less common than it is now. And it was very much frowned on. The expectation was that she would have stopped working as soon as she got married. But this system seemed to work very well, and she was very happy for a couple of years, going backwards and forwards to meet David. She became very friendly with a doctor called Louisa Garrett Anderson. She was a very keen suffragette, and together with another suffragette, Flora Murray, they set up an extraordinary hospital in Endell Street. It was a military hospital, but it was run entirely by suffragettes. All the doctors, all the staff, they were all women. And it was a very egalitarian hospital. Unlike normal military hospitals, the officers and the soldiers were all treated in the same wards. And together, Louisa Garrett Anderson and Helen Gwynne-Vaughan, as she then was, set up the University of London Suffrage Society. Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson were both very keen suffragettes. They were militants. They approved of women who were throwing bricks through windows and being violent and going on hunger strike. Helen Gwynne-Vaughan didn't. She was rather like the banner in this march here. She was a law-abiding suffragist. On the other hand, what she cared about more than getting the vote was the economic position of women. She wanted women to be economically independent, and she thought that was much more important than enabling them to vote. So she continued like this for 2 or 3 years, but then her husband died of consumption. And she was absolutely, absolutely devastated by that. That was 1915 when he died of consumption. And she did what many women did during this wartime period. She tried to contact him through spiritualism and through automatic writing. This isn't her, this is an imaginary picture. But spiritualism underwent a great revival during the war period. A lot of people were trying to communicate with their husbands and fathers who died. And it was scientifically, it was quite endorsed. Had some very famous supporters, such as Pierre Curie and the evolutionist Alfred Russel Wallace, and a very distinguished physicist called Alfred Lodge. And she approached it quite scientifically. She kept notes about all her episodes of automatic writing and when she supposedly received messages from her husband, David. But this was a very, very miserable period for her. She became very, very depressed. She didn't know what to do with herself, and she undertook various medical training courses. But it was the war, and she'd lost her husband, and she was really quite devastated. And then suddenly, so almost overnight, her life changed. She got a phone call from her friend Louisa Garrett Anderson at the Endell Street Hospital. So she went racing round there. And much to her surprise, she was offered a job as the controller in France of the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, which she accepted. Now, at the beginning of the war, the general assumption had been that yes, women should do their bit, but they should stay at home. The idea of women going abroad, except for nurses, but other women were very, very firmly kept at home. And then by about 1917, the army and the government woke up and realized that women could be quite useful abroad. And so they set up what was called the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. One of the reasons that she was chosen was because she was a soldier's daughter. That's sort of how things worked then. And you can see an advertising poster on the right with this cheery woman in a uniform and that rather patronizing slogan, "Every fit woman can release a fit man." And the idea was that the women should go out to the front and they should take over all the routine, mundane sort of work, like doing the cleaning and the cooking, driving ambulances and work like that, so that then the men could be released to go to the front. And by the end of the war, about 60,000 women had served in these armed forces, and she led a corps of around 10,000 women over to France. So here's a picture of some of them drilling in Hyde Park. You can see they're in excellent military formation and very neatly dressed. But this was another situation where she found she didn't really fit in at all. She remembered the journey over the channel by boat. The day was misty and very still. Crossing the channel, one seemed to pass through dissolution into a new and different world. How different, I did not at first realize. And she's written a book of memoirs about her time when she was in the army. And at least a third of it was taken up with discussions about uniform and the women's role. So you can see this is the army uniform that she designed herself. And there were endless arguments about the length of their skirts, whether or not they should have breast pockets on the jackets to keep notebooks and things in, how much of the hair should the hat cover, what sort of badges should they have, all sorts of details like that. And she found it extremely hard to convince the male soldiers with whom she was working that the women who she was responsible for were taking the war seriously. And there was a constantly stated assumption that most of them were prostitutes and they had only come over to be closer to the men and they were incapable of carrying out hard labor. So you can see this is just one of many cartoons that were produced. Our Amazon core standing easy. It's a sort of satire showing these women with their uniforms sort of tightly clinched at the waist and putting on lipstick. They're more interested in their appearance than they are in whatever it is that they're meant to be doing. And for women, wearing a uniform was symbolically really important because it meant that they were representing their country, they were contributing to the war effort. But for men, they thought that women didn't deserve to wear uniform and that anyway khaki was far too expensive. And Helen Gwynne-Vaughan had to put up with some awful jokes amongst the men. So when she was in the mess and was sitting around, the standard joke was the one on the awful pun on the right. It's better to have a whack on the knee than a slap on the back. And she had to listen to comments like that again and again and again. But she did succeed. She really struggled, but she managed to convince the men in the army by the end of the war that the women were really doing a good job and had made important contribution. She had a reputation as being superbly efficient, and at the end of the war, although she wanted to go back to Birkbeck, the end of the war, she was offered a position to head up the Women's Royal Air Force. And you can see her on the left in her brigadier's uniform, and she was extremely effective and completely reformed the Air Force. So she was made a Dame of the British Empire. And on the right, there's a picture of her inspecting troops during the Second World War. So she led a very distinguished military career during the First World War. And then afterwards, she wanted to go back into academic research. So this is So I use this book just to show her academic research. The diagram on the left is the frontispiece of the book. She didn't really want to go back to Birkbeck because it stirred up memories of her husband. So she applied to Aberdeen, but she didn't get the job, and a man got the job, and she spent her whole life convinced that she'd been discriminated against, which might or might not have been true. But she went back to Birkbeck as she had no alternative. So here she is. You can see she worked right up from 1920, right up to the Second World War, and then for a few years during the Second World War as well. So she was the head of department. She was also a professor of botany. Very, very, very unusual for a woman. But she complained continuously about the way she was treated. So for one thing, her department, the Department of Botany, wasn't in that main Central University of London site where it is now. Her department was in Chancery Lane, in a very ramshackle, narrow building. And according to her, her department could only be reached by tiptoeing through other lecture rooms. And you can see here she's teaching men who'd just come back from the war. Many of them were older. They must have found it very difficult and surprising to be taught by a woman in a scientific subject and to know that she was a professor. And I think it's interesting that here, in this picture and the last one I showed you, she's adopted a very sort of masculine uniform. I mean, she's wearing a shirt and a tie, very different from those glamorous dresses that she was wearing before. And she ran the department extremely efficiently. I mean, as though she were still heading a corps in the army. So she clamped down immediately if there was any insubordination, and it said that she had a small hole in the wall of her office so she could listen to everyone lecturing and vet what they were doing. And she became very almost obsessed with maintaining order and cleanliness. Well, that's what people say about her. But I think part of the problem is that she was the head of department. She'd been the head of a huge military organization. She was very efficient. She told people what to do. She approved efficiency. If she'd been a man, she'd have been respected as being very authoritative and in charge. But I think because she was a woman, she was regarded as being very authoritarian, and there's that word bossy, which has got such feminine, female overtones. So I think it's rather unfair to criticize her for controlling the department, because that's what she was meant to be doing. So for official photos, she didn't have the shirt and tie on. She had a sort of more feminine, softer look. And she did, as I mentioned, she became very renowned for this 1927 textbook. You can see at the bottom it's produced, it's a Cambridge Botanical Handbook. It was very much admired because it was very clear and it was very comprehensive, and it became a very popular student textbook on mycology. On the other hand, she was also criticised for being too didactic, for just informing its readers rather than encouraging them to think. So there's the same sort of top-down approach that she'd used in running the army and in running her department. And she was gradually eased off university committees. By the time of the Second World War, she was no longer active in research, and she only lasted a couple of years in the army. She had a very senior position, but people found her too difficult to work for, and so she was rather summarily dismissed. And her life after that was rather sad. She became rather lonely. She was rather deaf, and she lived on her own. And she became very reclusive. Some people said she was eccentric. I think the last few years of her life were quite unhappy. And she always felt that she'd been unfairly excluded from greater success. And it's very hard to evaluate how reasonable her objections were, because, of course, all the surviving accounts have been written very subjectively. So there's several questions hanging over her that you could say she was unreasonably uncooperative. You could say she was just being efficient, or You could say she transgressed accepted norms of politeness, or she just behaving like a man, not how a woman was expected to behave. Some people thought she was a stellar researcher, other people said she clung to old-fashioned ideas. And on the one hand, she was absolutely committed to improving working conditions for women, especially for working class women. But on the other hand, she'd been born into this fantastic aristocratic milieu, and she retained very old fashioned convictions of upper class superiority. And so sometimes she was extremely supportive, but she could also be very overbearing. So there's sort of big uncertainty hanging over her in that way. But at last, after years of being virtually forgotten, in March 2020, the English Heritage put up a blue plaque on the block of flats in central London, where she lived for almost 50 years. And so it seems to me that perhaps more than any other woman of her generation, as a scientist and a military officer, she'd ventured into two male-dominated territories, and in each one she'd fought her way to the top. But when she got there, she found that women, as well as men, resented her success. So, Nathan, I'm going to stop there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you ever so much. What a wonderful talk.
I'll unshare my screen. Yep, there I am.
So we have time, I believe, for some questions. If anyone has any questions, please type them into the chat and we'll get through as many as we possibly can. I think maybe to ask a question while people wait. I suppose, to what extent do you feel that Helen Gwynne-Vaughan moving into studying fungi as being quite a unstudied area of botany at the time?
Oh, I think
was that deliberate, or was that why fungi?
I think at the time it was seen as more important than it is now. I mean, there were more. I know that during the First World War, in particular, food preservation was enormously important, and so there wasn't the refrigeration that there is now. So I think there was a lot of molds and fungi and various other things around that. For practical reasons, people wanted to study, and also the boundary between animals and plants and fungi and protista wasn't really set up until later. So I think there was a lot of debate about whether fungi were animals or plants, and similarly with protista like slime molds, it was very difficult to know how to categorize them. And also, it was a very suitable subject for women. I think in general, a lot of people were very interested in, men and women were very interested in the natural world. If you think of all those gentlemanly fossil collectors of the 19th century, and for women especially, botany was something that they could do. They could do it themselves. They didn't need to be chaperoned everywhere. They didn't have to go into a laboratory. So it was a sort of subject that was much more common for women to undertake than it is now, I think.
Fantastic. So there is the chat. If anyone would like to ask any questions, please put them into the chat. I'll ask another one. How come her career in the army? You mentioned the Air Force. It's only a couple of years. I mean, how much had changed in between the First World War and the Second World War in terms of like women's role in the military? Was she outdated, or was it?
I think she did do various sit on various sort of voluntary army committees and things between the First and the Second World War, but I think, as I keep saying, it's difficult to judge from the documents, and people always write very subjective assessments. I think she probably was rather difficult to deal with on committees, but I think part of this problem was exacerbated by the fact that she was a woman, and the expectations were that she should be very quiet and very submissive. And we've all met people on committees who dominate the conversation and order everybody else around, or who talk too much. But now men and women can behave equally under those circumstances. But then women had to be polite and quiet. So I think when a woman was slightly out of order, it seemed far worse than it actually was. At least that's how I interpret it.
I have a question. So how many years did she actually do mycology? I lost track.
Oh, I see. Well, she joined the Linnean Society in 1905, and that was also the year that she went as a demonstrator, I think, to the Royal Holloway College. The book came out in 1927. She was head of the Department of Botany, so presumably she had to do quite a lot of other forms of botany as well as the fungi. So I'm not sure exactly. I mean, fungi were her speciality, and they were then classed as plants when she started out. So by 1927, she put herself in the position of being one of the world experts.
But that's 22 years then, minus the war years, World War One.
Well, that she. So from 1905 to 27, yeah, that's 22 years minus the war years, yes. But she went on doing research after that. But the general opinion was that she sort of she adhered to an interpretation that was no longer current, and she refused to change her mind and keep up with the latest thinking in botany. So that's why her book was extremely good as a textbook, but it was very dogmatic and it became old-fashioned.
I was just going to say I have a copy of the book, and it's got very nice illustrations.
Yeah.
We have a question from James Mushett, who asks, how big a role do you feel she played in the struggle for suffrage?
How important a role did she play in suffrage? Well, I mean, she and Louisa Garrett Anderson founded the University of London Suffrage Society, so quite a lot. But as far as I'm aware, she wasn't on any of the national committees or anything like that. I mean, she had a full-time job. I mean, it was a bit difficult.
I
think it's interesting. I think the division between the suffragists and the suffragettes is quite interesting, because it's very easy to look back in the early years of the 20th century, and the tendency is to think, well, women did this, so you think that all women campaigned for the vote, for example. But so there were some women who believed that you should adopt violent means. A majority of women believed you shouldn't adopt violent means. And there was a whole other group of women who tend to get rather left out, who actually didn't particularly want to get the vote, and who also thought that women's responsibilities lay at home. So but by no means all women were supporting her campaign to stay at work, not have children, even though she was married. Especially after the war, a lot of people thought that it was the woman's role to stay at home. There was a shortage of jobs, and so the idea was that the men should get the jobs, and the women should stay at home. So there was absolutely not uniformity amongst women. I mean, just like there isn't now, but I think there's a tendency when you look back at the past, especially as the suffrage movement was so famous, it's easy to assume that all women wanted the vote, but that's not so true. And it's like she was very, very keen on women having economic independence, and that's exactly what Virginia Woolf said in her famous book, A Room of One's Own, that I called my book after. In A Room of One's Own, she wrote quite candidly that actually when women got the vote in 1918, I didn't really care about that. What really interested me was that was the year my aunt died, and she left me some money, and having the money and the economic freedom and independence was far more important for her and for a lot of other women than actually getting the vote.
We have a question. We have Sally asks, you mentioned she fought for working women's rights. Did she mentor anyone who went on to be influential in their field?
What, in botany?
In botany or fungi or anything like that. Yes.
She was very supportive of younger women, but she was quite hard to work for. I don't know of anybody in particular that she mentored. No, I don't know. I know she was very when she was in the army. She was very supportive. For example, there was one woman whose husband had died, and of course she died during the war, and of course she'd had the experience of her own husband having died. And in situations like that, she could be very kind, and a lot of people thought that she was a fantastic role model. So it's sort of part of what I'm saying. There's very divergent comments on her. I mean, some people say she's autocratic and overbearing, and then other people say that she was very supportive. So it's difficult to know exactly what she was like. Well, she certainly behaved unconventionally for how women were expected to behave at the time.
A couple of comments here. Mariko Parslow writes, not a question, just thank you for an interesting talk. Fungi textbooks were short when I started fungal study in 1999. I'm very new to it and had to read through HGB's Fungi as my introduction, enforced by my group leader. The book included an astonishing amount of references and I admire it very much. She has never written in her book about her being female, another point of my admiration. Emma Williams writes, her book had gone under my radar. Just found a first edition copy in America and it's on its way.
Oh, fantastic. Oh,
looking forward to reading her dogmatic style. Thank you for promoting.
Okay. Well, I confess I haven't I haven't read it. I've read some of Guglielmo Lista's writing, but I haven't read any of hers.
I suppose we'll have a couple more seconds just in case there's any more questions, and if not, we might perhaps call it there. Well, thank you ever so much for a wonderful talk.
Enjoyed it.
If there's any closing statements you'd like to make, the floor is yours. And other than that, thank you ever so much.
Sorry, the floor is mine. Sorry, is that what you said?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for listening, and I hope you share my enthusiasm for Helen Gwynne-Vaughan. And Nathan and I were chatting before the talk started, and I said I'd really like to talk about Guglielmo Lista because I think she's another fascinating woman.
We'll try and get that book talk booked in later. Other than that, thank you everyone for coming along, and have a wonderful rest of the evening and a wonderful rest of the month.
Okay. Well, thank you. Goodbye to everybody.